I fastened my seatbelt with one hand and adjusted his little thermos with the other. He was humming something under his breath as we pulled out of the driveway. I remember every note. A traffic light, sunlight flashing across the windshield. 1 second, and everything turned to silence. I saw his body jolt against the belt, felt my heart shatter in that sound. I wasn't drunk. I wasn't distracted. I just turned the wrong way. Sometimes the worst doesn't happen because you were careless. It happens because you were the one driving. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Allison Harper. I was 36 years old the morning everything changed. I had lived in the same small town in Vermont all my life, in a weather-worn two-bedroom house with blue shutters and a yard just big enough for a swing set and a dying maple tree. I was a pediatric nurse at the local clinic. My days were long, my nights were short, and my world, in every sense, revolved around my son. His name was Luke. He was 6, and he had a laugh like wind chimes caught in a spring breeze. Sharp, light, impossible to forget. That morning began the way most mornings did, with a beep. Not from an alarm clock, I hadn't needed one in years, but from the microwave, announcing that the instant oatmeal was done. I stood barefoot in the kitchen, rubbing sleep from my eyes, my robe tied haphazardly over the t-shirt I had slept in. Outside, the sky was just beginning to turn a paler shade of blue. The snow had fallen quietly in the night, coating the lawn in a powdery layer of white. My car was already half buried. I knew I should have moved it to the garage. Luke's footsteps pitter-pattered down the hall, followed by the telltale creak of the third floorboard, a sound I used to hate before I loved it. He wore his favorite dinosaur pajamas, one sleeve already pushed up, his hair a wild crown of soft brown tangles. He climbed onto a chair at the table and greeted the oatmeal with suspicion. I handed him the spoon and promised, again, that we'd get chocolate chip pancakes on Saturday. I packed his lunch while sipping lukewarm coffee. Turkey sandwich, apple slices, one of those yogurt tubes that always ended up leaking somehow. I checked the weather on my phone. Snow flurries, low visibility. I made a mental note to leave early. My shift started at 9, and I had just enough time to drop Luke at school and make it to the clinic before the patients started lining up. He was humming as he put on his boots. Some song from the cartoon he liked, the one with the talking trains. I helped him zip up his puffer jacket, adjusted his scarf, kissed the tip of his nose. He wrinkled it and made a face. I laughed. I didn't know it would be the last time. The drive was routine. Our little town was the kind of place where roads wound around each other like braided yarn. The streets were mostly empty that early in the morning, just a few other parents making the same trek, headlights glowing in the fog. Luke chattered about a spelling test, about a drawing he was making for me, about wanting to build a fort in the living room after school. I nodded along, half listening, my thoughts already on the day ahead. Vaccines, paperwork, a new intern starting her first shift. The car was warm. Luke's voice filled the space like music. I reached out at a stoplight to adjust the heat, glancing at him in the mirror. He smiled at me, cheeks pink from the cold, eyes bright. I remember that exact image, frozen in my mind like a photograph. His face framed by the collar of his jacket, one mitten half on, his breath fogging the window. We took the same route we always did, left at the gas station, right past the library, then onto the main road toward the school. I had driven it so many times I could do it with my eyes closed. That morning, I almost did. There was ice, black ice. I hadn't seen it. No one ever does. The turn came fast, and the tires lost grip. I didn't panic. I had driven in worse. But there was a truck coming around the bend, bigger, faster, unexpected. I turned the wheel too hard. The car skidded sideways, and for one weightless moment, everything hung in the balance. Then came the sound, the impact, the scream of metal folding in on itself. My scream, Luke's scream, and then silence. I opened my eyes to a shattered windshield, blood on my hand, smoke curling from the dashboard. The air was filled with the chemical stench of the airbag, the soft hiss of a punctured tire. My ears rang. I reached out blindly. Luke's name left my mouth like a prayer. Again, again. No answer. I couldn't move at first. My seatbelt locked, holding me like a vice. My fingers fumbled with the buckle. When it finally clicked free, I turned toward the passenger seat. His head was slumped forward, his hands still in his lap, eyes closed. There was no blood. That gave me hope. But his chest wasn't rising. His body was too still. I called his name again, louder. My voice cracked. I shook his arm, gently at first, then harder, begging, bargaining, sobbing. 1,000 thoughts raced through me, each one more frantic than the last. I was a nurse. I had training. I knew what to do. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Nothing mattered but his silence. The ambulance came. The sirens cut through the stillness like knives. I was pulled from the wreckage, wrapped in a blanket, questioned. My injuries were minor. My world was not. I sat in the ER with dried blood on my shirt and glass in my hair, waiting for someone to say something that would make it untrue. A doctor I had trained with approached, eyes already filled with grief. He didn't need to speak. I saw the truth written in the way he held his clipboard, in the way he avoided looking at me directly. They let me see him. He looked asleep, peaceful. His cheeks were still pink from the cold. I whispered his name, hoping he'd stir, hoping for anything, hoping God would rewind the last hour and let me start again. But he didn't move, and time didn't rewind. Outside, the snow kept falling. The roads were closed. The world stood still. And I sat beside the body of my son, my hands trembling, my heart broken into pieces I could no longer hold. It was supposed to be a normal morning. Breakfast, school, work. A routine so familiar it should have been forgettable. But it became the line that split my life in two, before and after. Everything that followed would be colored by that drive, that turn, that patch of ice, that 1 second where I was behind the wheel, that 1 second where everything changed. The days that followed were a blur of sterile hallways, whispered condolences, and a kind of silence that didn't exist before. It wasn't the silence of peace or stillness. It was a silence that screamed, that clawed at my insides, that drowned out everything else. It lived in the spaces where Luke's voice used to be, in the back seat of my car, in the empty cereal bowl on the kitchen table, in the toys that remained exactly where he left them. I was discharged from the hospital with a sprained wrist and a minor concussion. They gave me pills for the pain, but not the kind I needed. No one gives you medicine for guilt. I remember the nurse touching my shoulder gently, as if I were already broken glass. I remember the way people looked at me in the hallway, some with pity, others with curiosity, some averting their eyes like grief was contagious. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I simply nodded when told and signed what needed to be signed. My body moved. My mind had gone elsewhere. The funeral came too quickly. I wasn't ready, but time didn't care. The woman at the funeral home spoke in a tone reserved for the grieving, delicate, and measured, like she was afraid that a wrong word might tip me over an edge I was already falling from. She asked me what music Luke liked. I said he liked all of it. That wasn't true. He hated jazz. But in that moment, nothing mattered. The truth had become a shattered mirror. I couldn't piece it together anymore. The day of the service, I wore a black dress that hadn't seen daylight in years. It felt like a costume. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself. My face was too pale, my eyes too dark, and my hands trembled when I tried to zip up the back. My mother offered to help, her fingers cold against my skin. She said something. I think it was meant to comfort me, but I heard none of it. The chapel was full, but it felt empty. Faces blurred. Voices became echoes. Someone gave a eulogy. Someone else read a poem. I stood by the casket and kept my hands folded so tightly they left crescents on my palms. Luke's favorite stuffed animal, Mr. Fox, lay beside him, dressed in the tiny blue sweater I had knitted last winter. The sight of it undid me. I turned away, afraid I might scream. Afterward, people came to me with condolences wrapped in familiar phrases. "He's in a better place." "You're so strong." "Time heals." I wanted to shout at them. I wanted to ask them what place could possibly be better than alive in my arms. I wanted to tell them I wasn't strong. I was just breathing because my body didn't know how to stop. I wanted to tell them that time was the enemy, dragging me farther away from the last time I heard him laugh. Instead, I nodded and thanked them, my voice hollow and rehearsed. I smiled when expected, stood when expected, swallowed when expected. I felt like an actor in a tragedy I hadn't auditioned for. When the house emptied, when the dishes had been cleaned and returned to their owners, when the sympathy cards stopped arriving and the phone stopped ringing, the real silence arrived. The heavy kind, the kind that lived in the walls and breathed down your neck. I wandered from room to room, unsure of what I was looking for. His room remained untouched. The sheets still smelled like his shampoo. His drawings were still taped to the wall, crooked and bright, defiant against the dullness of everything else. I sat on his bed and picked up a sock from the floor, just one. I held it like it was sacred, pressed it to my chest, and finally cried. Not the kind of tears that fall slowly, beautifully. No, these were the kind that racked your whole body, that stole the air from your lungs, that made you wish you could shatter into pieces small enough to disappear. I don't know how long I stayed there. The sun rose, the sun set, days passed, hunger didn't come, sleep didn't stay. I stopped going to work. I ignored the voicemails from the clinic, the texts from friends. I couldn't face the world where Luke didn't exist. Every street corner was a wound, every child's voice a blade. Even the smell of antiseptic made me nauseous. I had once been a nurse who comforted grieving mothers. Now I couldn't stand the sight of a hospital. The irony wasn't lost on me. At night, I lay awake, replaying the crash over and over. The turn, the ice, the truck. I saw it in flashes like broken film. I heard the sound of metal against metal, the shriek of tires, the thud of impact. But mostly I heard nothing. The silence after. The unbearable, unforgivable silence. I began to question everything. Why didn't I see the ice? Why didn't I slow down more? Why that route? Why that day? Why us? There were no answers, only questions with teeth. I scribbled them in notebooks, on napkins, on the back of receipts. I left them scattered around the house like clues to a mystery I couldn't solve. Some nights I would wake up reaching for him, convinced I'd heard him call my name. My hands would grope the sheets, desperate for the weight of his body curled beside mine. But there was nothing, just the cold imprint of memory, just my own breath, ragged and meaningless. I tried therapy. My mother insisted. The woman was kind, soft-spoken, with eyes that held no judgment. I sat across from her for 6 sessions and said nothing. I watched the clock tick down, minute by minute, like a prisoner counting days. She didn't push, she just waited. Eventually, I stopped going. I visited his grave once, just once. I stood there, a bouquet of sunflowers trembling in my hands, and felt like a trespasser. The ground felt too still, too final. I whispered an apology, though I knew it meant nothing. I left the flowers and didn't go back. Guilt lived in my bones. It colored every thought, every movement. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a presence, a shadow that followed me, sat with me, breathed with me. I wore it like a second skin. I was the mother who had been behind the wheel. I was the one who had made the turn. I was the one who had survived. People stopped asking how I was. I think they grew tired of hearing nothing. I think they were afraid of the honesty I might offer if I spoke. The truth was, I wasn't. I wasn't okay. I wasn't healing. I wasn't functioning. I was existing. And even that felt like betrayal. There was no roadmap for this kind of loss, no checklist, no timeline, just the endless ache of absence, the suffocating weight of love with nowhere to go. Some days I forgot how to speak. Some days I screamed into pillows until my throat went raw. Some days I stared at the ceiling and imagined what his voice would sound like at 7, at 10, at 16. Grief wasn't a river, it was a tide, sometimes calm, sometimes crashing, but always there. It seeped into everything, made colors dull and moments meaningless. It took away not just Luke, but the version of me that existed with him, the mother, the nurse, the woman who believed the world was mostly good. I didn't know who I was now, only who I wasn't. And that, more than anything, was the sharpest pain of all. Grief, I learned, wasn't content to simply live in your chest. It seeped into your bloodstream, your spine, your skin. It rewired the way I moved through the world, like a parasite borrowing my limbs to carry its weight. But guilt was different. Guilt was a voice. It whispered, it argued, it accused. It didn't just sit beside you like grief did. It stared you in the face and said, "You did this." And I did. The world didn't tell me I was guilty. The police cleared me. The insurance company sent their condolences along with dry legal language that labeled the crash an unfortunate incident. Even the truck driver who hit us sent word through his lawyer. He didn't blame me. But none of that mattered. I blamed me. Every cell in my body did. And soon there was no room for anything else. I stopped looking in mirrors. My reflection made me sick. I saw a woman with hollow eyes and chapped lips, hair that hung in clumps, skin that looked like it had forgotten sunlight. But worse than the decay was the familiarity. I looked exactly the same. The woman who had killed her son looked just like the woman who used to sing him lullabies. That was the unbearable part. I began avoiding places with windows. The outside world was too bright, too fast, too filled with people who didn't know. People who laughed and ran errands and walked hand in hand with children who were still alive. I resented them. Then I hated myself for resenting them. I felt like I was rotting from the inside out, and everyone else was breathing air I didn't deserve. Sleep became something I feared, not because of nightmares, but because of the dreams. The dreams where Luke was still alive, where I could hear his voice calling me from the hallway, where I held him in my arms and felt his breath on my shoulder. Those dreams broke me. Waking up was worse than the crash itself. Every morning I had to lose him all over again. I began punishing myself in small, deliberate ways. I refused to turn on the heat, even as the cold set into the walls of the house. I slept without a blanket. I stopped using sugar in my coffee because he had loved it sweet. I gave away my favorite coat. I stopped wearing the perfume he used to say smelled like cookies. I wanted to hurt. I needed to. It felt like the only honest thing left. People tried. At first. My mother called every other day, her voice soft and tentative, as if speaking too loudly might shatter me. I let her calls go to voicemail. Friends left meals on my doorstep. Lasagna, casseroles, soups in carefully labeled containers. I lined them up in the fridge and let them spoil. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away, but I couldn't eat them either. It felt wrong to taste comfort. The worst part wasn't the loneliness, it was the awareness that I was choosing it. I was building walls around myself brick by brick, and no one could stop me. I didn't want company. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted silence thick enough to bury me. I wanted time to stand still, because every minute forward felt like another betrayal of the life I'd lost. I started walking at night, at first just around the block, then farther. Hours passed beneath the glow of street lamps as I wandered aimlessly through empty neighborhoods. The cold bit at my cheeks, but I welcomed it. I sometimes ended up at the school playground. I would sit on the bench, watching the empty swings move in the wind. Once I climbed onto one and let myself sway back and forth until my arms burned. I closed my eyes and imagined Luke next to me, his feet kicking the air, his laugh rising with the creak of the chains. I knew how people saw me, the whispers at the grocery store, the glances in the pharmacy line, the careful smiles that died too quickly. I was the woman from the accident, the mother, the cautionary tale. Some pitied me, others judged me. I did both, relentlessly. On the rare occasions I left the house during the day, I avoided eye contact. I wore sunglasses even when it was cloudy. I didn't want to see the recognition in their faces, or worse, the relief that they weren't me. I wondered how many of them clutched their children tighter when I passed, how many of them whispered my story behind closed doors. The guilt began to twist into something sharper, something more dangerous. I started imagining conversations that hadn't happened. I heard Luke asking why I didn't save him. I saw his face in other children. I began believing that maybe he had known somehow, in those final seconds, that it was my fault, that I had failed him in the most fundamental way a mother could. I wrote him letters I never mailed. I filled notebooks with apologies, confessions, prayers I no longer believed in. I'm sorry I drove that day. I'm sorry I couldn't trade places with you. I'm sorry I lived. I wrote until my fingers cramped, until my tears blurred the ink. I wrote because speaking felt impossible. Words turned to ash in my mouth, but on the page at least, I could bleed. There was one night I stood in the bathroom holding a bottle of sleeping pills, not with the intent to die, not exactly, but I wanted to feel nothing. I wanted silence inside my own head. I poured them into my palm, counted them slowly, deliberately. 10, 20, 30. I stared at them until dawn. Then I flushed them, not because I had changed my mind, but because I didn't want to give anyone else the burden of my ending. I realized, slowly, painfully, that I wasn't living anymore. I was punishing. Every breath I took was an act of self-inflicted retribution. Every step forward was a reminder that he couldn't take one. I had become both prisoner and jailer, judge and executioner. I had made myself the villain in my own life because I couldn't bear to be the victim. I stopped being Allison Harper. I was no longer a nurse, no longer a mother, no longer a person. I was a wound, a walking testament to what happens when love and tragedy collide. I avoided the hospital where I used to work. I ignored the texts from colleagues. I donated my scrubs to a shelter and told myself it was kindness. The truth was, I couldn't wear them without seeing his face. I began to believe I didn't deserve to be part of the world anymore, not just because of the accident, but because of how easily I had disappeared. The world hadn't stopped turning. Spring came, the snow melted, children returned to school, flowers bloomed on the neighbor's porch, but I remained in winter. Guilt had fused with identity. I no longer mourned the accident as an event. I mourned myself as a person who could have and should have prevented it. I became the question no one wanted to ask. What happens when the person you love most dies because of you? I didn't have an answer, only an echo, only a life split down the middle, with no map, no signposts, no way back. I was my own enemy, my own ghost, and I didn't know how to be anything else. The first letter I wrote to Luke began with his name and nothing else. I stared at the word until the letters lost meaning. It looked too small on the page, too fragile to hold the weight of what I wanted to say. I sat at the kitchen table, pen gripped too tightly, a cold cup of coffee beside me, untouched. The house was still, the kind of stillness that rang in your ears and filled your lungs with something heavier than air. It was raining that morning, thin, quiet rain, barely more than mist. I opened a window just enough to let it in. I wanted the smell of wet earth to fill the room, wanted something real, something outside of me, to mingle with the pain. I think I believed it would help me feel closer to him, as if rain knew how to carry grief better than silence. Dear Luke, I wrote again, and this time the words began to follow. Not easily, not gracefully, but they came, halting, uneven, uncertain, like a child learning to walk. I told him I was sorry. I told him I missed him. I told him I saw a little boy in the grocery store the other day who looked like him, and I had to leave the cart and run to the car before I broke down. I told him I didn't know how to keep living without him, but that I was trying, or pretending, or failing. I wrote until my wrist ached and the ink bled through the page. I didn't reread it. I folded the letter into quarters and placed it inside an old shoebox, one of the few things I hadn't touched since the accident. It used to hold school supplies, crayons, glue sticks, stickers with dinosaurs and stars. Now it would hold pieces of me, the pieces I couldn't say out loud. After that, I wrote almost every day. Some letters were short, only a few lines. Some were pages long, confessions I didn't know I needed to make. I told him about the things I remembered, how he used to line up his cereal pieces before eating them, how he called the moon night's flashlight, how he'd fall asleep holding my finger like it was a rope he didn't want to let go of. I told him about the things I was afraid to forget, the weight of his body when I carried him from the car, the exact color of his eyes in the morning, the way he said, "Mommy," like it was a secret. Other days, I told him about the world without him, how I couldn't walk past the playground near the elementary school, how I flinched every time I heard a child laugh, how his room remained exactly as it was, a museum of the life we had. His toothbrush was still in the holder, his jacket still hung by the door. I knew one day I would have to pack it all away, but I wasn't ready. I didn't know if I would ever be. I began storing the letters in the closet, hidden behind a row of winter coats. I didn't want anyone to find them, not because I was ashamed, but because they weren't for anyone else. They were my proof of love, of guilt, of survival. They were the only conversations I still had with him. Some nights I wrote with tears blurring the ink, soaking the paper until it curled at the edges. Other nights I wrote in the dark, the only light coming from the lamp in the hallway, casting long shadows across the floor. Writing became a ritual, a prayer, a kind of penance. I no longer knew if I was writing to keep him close or to keep myself from falling further away. I didn't tell anyone about the letters, not my mother, not the therapist I'd stopped seeing, not the woman from the grief group who kept leaving me voicemails I couldn't bring myself to answer. It felt like something sacred, private, mine. In a world where everything had been stripped from me, the letters were the only thing I chose. But even in that ritual, the guilt remained. I started to wonder if the act of writing was a form of self-indulgence, if I was holding on too tightly to a boy who no longer existed, if I was keeping him from resting by refusing to let go. The thought haunted me. Some nights, I held the box to my chest and asked him, aloud, if he wanted me to stop. I always imagined the answer was no. I don't know if that was hope or delusion. One day, a letter came in the mail. It was handwritten, addressed to me, the envelope smudged from weather. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a note from a woman I hadn't spoken to in months, a mother I had met once at a grief circle, long before I had the strength to speak. Her daughter had died from a heart condition. She wrote that she thought of me often, that she lit a candle for Luke every week, that she understood the kind of pain that lived in your bones. Her words didn't fix anything, but they didn't try to, and that made them mean more. I wrote back, a short note, 3 sentences. It took me an hour to write. When I mailed it, I felt a tremor of something I hadn't felt in months. Not peace, not closure, but connection. A thin thread stretched between two mothers who knew what it was to bury a part of themselves. After that, I started writing different letters, not to Luke, but to people I had pushed away. Not many, just 1 or 2. I wrote to the woman who ran the front office at the clinic, telling her I missed the smell of coffee in the break room. I wrote to my former neighbor, thanking her for the flowers she left on my porch every Sunday for 2 months straight, even when I never acknowledged them. I didn't send most of them, but I wrote them, and that was something. The letters to Luke continued. They changed over time. They became less about apology and more about memory. I started telling him stories of his birth, of the first time he said balloon, of the way he used to crawl under the kitchen table when he was scared. I wrote them not because I was trying to keep him alive, but because I didn't want him to disappear. One evening, I took the box from the closet and carried it to the backyard. The sun was setting. The sky was a watercolor of orange and lavender. I sat on the porch steps, the box beside me, and thought about burning it. I had read somewhere that fire releases grief, that the smoke carries it into the sky, where it can't hurt you anymore. But I didn't strike the match. I couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Instead, I opened the lid and pulled out the first letter, the one that just said his name. I held it in my lap and ran my fingers over the creases. I read it again, for the first time in months. My handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged, but every word burned with clarity. I folded it back up and placed it on top of the others. The stars began to appear, one by one, quiet and unbothered. I sat there until the cold crept up my spine and the wind tangled in my hair. Then I stood, brought the box back inside, and placed it gently beneath my bed. It was a letter no one would ever read, a conversation no one would ever hear, but it was mine. And for now, that was enough. I woke up one morning and realized the air in the house had gone stale. It had been months since I had opened the windows. Dust clung to the curtains. The refrigerator hummed like a distant machine in another life. It was as though the house itself had been holding its breath with me. The thought frightened me enough to get dressed and step outside. The sun was pale, the grass brittle, but the world still moved. I felt like a ghost at the edge of it, but at least I was outside. I had been living inside a cocoon of grief, waiting for it to dissolve me completely. But some quiet part of me had begun to rebel. It was not forgiveness. It was not hope. It was simply the refusal to disappear. That small voice grew louder when I saw the flyer tacked to the bulletin board at the grocery store. Volunteers needed at Haven House, it said in bold black letters. Underneath, in smaller print, support for children in crisis. I took a photo of it with my phone and stared at it for days. Then one morning, without telling anyone, I went. The building sat at the edge of town, low and unremarkable, with a cracked sidewalk leading up to the door. I parked in the lot and sat in the car for a long time, hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. My reflection in the rearview mirror stared back at me with that same hollow look I had come to know. I wanted to turn around. Instead, I opened the door and stepped out. Inside, the smell of crayons and disinfectant greeted me. The walls were covered with children's drawings, bright suns, crooked houses, stick figures holding hands. The woman at the front desk smiled politely, handed me a clipboard, and asked me to fill out a form. Her voice was kind but neutral. She didn't know me. She didn't know my story. That anonymity felt like mercy. I signed my name slowly, the letters trembling, as if I were signing it for the first time. My first day was overwhelming. Children moved through the halls like small storms, carrying stories heavier than their bodies. Some clung to stuffed animals. Some stared blankly at the floor. Some were loud and defiant, others silent and watchful. Their pain was different from mine, but familiar all the same. It clung to them like an invisible coat. I stood at the edge of the room, unsure of what to do with my hands, my voice, my presence. I felt like an intruder in a place where even the air seemed to know loss. I started small, sorting donated clothes, folding tiny shirts and socks into neat piles, making peanut butter sandwiches in the kitchen, sweeping the hallway when no one asked me to. At first, I avoided eye contact with the children. I was afraid of what I would see reflected back. But one afternoon, a little girl with braids and solemn eyes walked up to me and placed her hand in mine without a word. She didn't ask who I was. She didn't ask why I was there. She just held on. Her palm was warm, her grip firm. Something inside me cracked open, and for a moment, I felt both pain and something that almost resembled life. Each day, I went back. I arrived early, stayed late. I learned the rhythm of the place, the snack times, the play times, the quiet hours. I learned which children liked to draw, which liked to sit in silence, which needed someone to listen without responding. I didn't try to be a savior. I didn't try to erase their pain. I simply tried to be steady, a presence that didn't vanish. There were moments when it was unbearable. When I saw a boy the same age as Luke playing with a toy car and had to excuse myself to the bathroom, gripping the sink until my hands stopped shaking. When I heard a child laugh and it sounded so much like his laugh that I couldn't breathe. When one of the staff mentioned a birthday party and I had to swallow the sudden wave of grief before it drowned me in front of them all. But I stayed. I stayed because leaving felt like retreating back into the grave I had built for myself. I began writing less at night. Not because I had forgotten Luke, but because I had begun living in a world that included more than loss. The letters I did write changed. They were no longer only apologies. They were stories about the children at Haven House, about the moments of connection, about the days I managed to make someone smile. They were updates from the life I was trying to rebuild, a life where love had somewhere to go, even if it couldn't reach him. The other volunteers started to recognize me. They would nod, offer me coffee, sometimes ask for help carrying boxes. I was quiet, but they didn't seem to mind. In their eyes, I wasn't the woman who had lost her son. I was just another set of hands, another person trying to help. That anonymity was a relief. It allowed me to be something other than my tragedy. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, I sat on the steps outside Haven House and watched the streetlights flicker on. The sky was the color of bruised lavender. I felt tired, but it was a different kind of tired. Not the exhaustion of despair, but the fatigue of work, of effort, of being present. It felt almost like the way I used to feel after a long shift at the clinic, before everything ended. I held on to that feeling, fragile as it was. I still carried my grief like a stone in my chest. It didn't go away. I didn't expect it to, but it began to shift, to change shape. It no longer pinned me to the floor. Some days, it even gave me purpose. I had thought my life was over the day Luke died, but in the echo of his absence, I had found a way to reach toward others, not to replace him, not to redeem myself, but to keep from disappearing entirely. The first time one of the children hugged me goodbye, I almost flinched. It was a small boy with wide brown eyes and a nervous smile. He wrapped his arms around my waist and pressed his cheek against my sweater. I froze, my throat tight. Then, slowly, I rested a hand on his back. The warmth of that moment seeped into me like sunlight through a window. It wasn't healing. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. At night, when I returned home, the house still felt empty. His room was still untouched. The silence still lived in the walls. But there was a difference now. When I sat at the kitchen table, I no longer felt like I was drowning. I still felt the weight, but I also felt the ground beneath my feet. I was living among the living again, tentatively, imperfectly, but living. I didn't know what the future would look like. I didn't know if I would ever forgive myself. But I had begun to learn that grief could coexist with purpose, that pain could sit beside small acts of care without destroying them. I had begun to learn that even broken people could still reach out their hands, and so I kept going back to Haven House. I kept folding clothes. I kept making sandwiches. I kept sitting with children who had lost too much. And slowly, without realizing it, I began to stitch a thin thread between the person I had been and the person I was becoming. A thread not of redemption, but of persistence. A thread strong enough to hold me when nothing else could. Freedom didn't arrive with a sunrise or a moment of clarity. It came slowly, without ceremony. It crept into my life in fragments too small to notice at first. In the way I stood up a little straighter one morning. In the day I forgot, just for a breath, to feel ashamed. It wasn't peace. It wasn't even healing. It was simply movement, a faint stirring beneath the weight I had carried for so long, I forgot how heavy it was. I had always imagined that to be free, I would need to be forgiven, that someone, God, Luke, the universe, myself, would have to place their hand on my head and say, "It's time. You've suffered enough." But that voice never came. The apology I had lived inside wasn't something anyone else could accept on his behalf. The sentence I served was one of my own design, and still, somehow, I began to live again. I kept volunteering at Haven House. The kids knew my name now. Some said it with joy. Others whispered it. A few avoided it altogether, as if names carried too much meaning. I didn't mind. I wasn't there to be known. I was there to serve, to offer quiet steadiness in a world that had taken so much from them already. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since college. Not landscapes or portraits, just color. Swaths of blue and gray, ochre and rust. I didn't paint to express anything. I painted to feel my hand move, to prove I still had the will to create. I stacked the canvases in the hallway, leaned them against the wall like pieces of myself waiting to dry. There were still bad days, days when grief wrapped around my ribs like wire, tightening until I could hardly breathe. Days when I woke from dreams that left me crying before I even opened my eyes. But they didn't last as long anymore. I stopped fighting them. I let them come, like weather. And when they passed, I was still standing. That was something. I returned to the cemetery once. The grass was taller than it should have been. A few wildflowers grew between the stones. I brought a single sunflower and laid it at the base of the marker. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, my hands in the pockets of my coat, letting the wind move around me. The silence didn't crush me this time. It held me. It felt like he was close, not in the ground, but in the space around me. In the air I breathed, in the way my heart still beat. I didn't stay long. I didn't need to. I didn't go back again. Some places, once visited, remain inside you. One afternoon, a woman came to Haven House asking about volunteer opportunities. She looked tired in a familiar way, like her soul had been scraped thin. I noticed her hands trembled as she filled out the form. I made her tea and sat with her on the back steps, not saying anything, just being there. After a while, she said thank you without looking at me. I told her softly that I understood. She didn't ask what I meant. She didn't need to. I started writing again, not letters to Luke, not the aching monologues of guilt and memory, but short pieces, half stories, half meditations. I wrote about grief like it was a living thing, about the way silence can be a kind of prayer. I submitted one to a small online journal under a pen name. They published it. When I saw it on the screen, I cried. Not because of pride, because I had put something into the world that didn't come from loss, but from survival. I began walking again, really walking, not wandering. I mapped out routes through the city I used to avoid, stopped at coffee shops, sat on benches, and watched strangers pass by. The world looked different, not softer, but fuller. I noticed details again, the way sunlight filtered through leaves, the pattern of cracks in the sidewalk, the sound of wind moving through a chain-link fence. For a long time, I had only seen emptiness. Now I saw texture. People I hadn't spoken to in a year started reaching out, some with cautious kindness, some with tentative joy. I answered when I could. I declined when I couldn't. I learned that freedom meant choosing who to let in, when to speak, when to protect your own silence. I stopped feeling guilty for the days I needed to be alone. I stopped apologizing for the boundaries that kept me whole. Eventually, I returned to the clinic, not as a nurse, not yet. I sat down with the director and told her everything, not the way I told the grief group, not with trembling and shame, but with clarity, with a steady voice. She listened. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She offered me a part-time administrative role. No patience, just paperwork. A way to step back into the world I had abandoned. I said yes. That first day back in the building was harder than I expected. The smells, the sounds, the memories pressed in like a tide. But I didn't drown. I made it through. And the next day, I came back. I still wrote to Luke sometimes. Not every day. Just when something stirred. A story from the clinic. A moment at Haven House. A memory I couldn't bear to keep to myself. I kept the letters in the same box beneath my bed. It had become less of a shrine and more of a journal, a place to leave the pieces I wasn't ready to let go of. I knew I would never be the person I was before. I didn't want to be. She had lived with blind hope. I lived with honest pain. But I had also learned something she never knew: how to carry sorrow without being consumed by it, how to walk beside your own ruin and still reach for beauty. Forgiveness never came, not in the way I thought it would. There was no moment of absolution, no divine whisper that lifted the weight, but I had learned to live without it. I had learned that freedom was not the same as forgetting, not the same as being absolved. Freedom was waking up and choosing not to disappear. It was brushing your teeth, folding laundry, calling your mother back. It was hearing a child's laugh and letting yourself smile, even when your heart ached. Freedom was not peace. It was not lightness. It was not joy. It was breath. It was presence. It was sitting with your grief and saying, I see you, but I'm going to live anyway. That was how I moved forward, not with grand gestures or dramatic turns, but with quiet decisions, with choosing to love the world again, even though it had broken me. That was my freedom, and it had nothing to do with forgiveness.